A very good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the second session of the day at Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival 2022, curated by Oxford Bookstore. Our session, The Tale of Two and More Cities, has different elements. Today, with our delegates, we discuss writing about different cities with tales from Mumbai, Kolkata, California, and Shillong, and so much more. On our panel today, we have a journalist and author of best-selling crime fiction novel Hushabye Baby and the Puchku series of books, Deepanjana Pal. Our next panelist is the author of the book Spiced, Smoked, Pickled, Preserved, Indranee Ghosh. The book recalls a past in stories and recipes spanning a period from the early decades of the last century up until she left her hometown. Our third panelist is a writer and podcaster based in Kolkata. He's also the author of the novel Don't Let Him Know, Sandip Roy. Moderating the session today is Nilanjana S. She is the author of two award-winning fantasy novels, The Wildings and the 100 Names of Darkness, a collection of essays on reading The Girl Who Ate Books. We are thrilled to have you here with us today, and we are eagerly looking to the interesting session ahead of us. I would also request the audience to put their questions in the comments below. And without further ado, I hand over the session to Ms. Roy to take the conversation forward. Over to you, Nilanjana ma'am.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be at the Oxford Apeejay Festival again. I really miss being in Kolkata. And as it happens, today, everyone out here has some kind of connection with the city. Either we've lived there or we've left there with very happy memories. I looked at the topic, A Tale of Two Cities, and actually there's a lot of them between all of your books. And it struck me that a sense of place is one of the most difficult things actually to convey in literature or in other kinds of fiction. And here we have Indranee with a memoir, which includes food writing and personal stories about her family in Shillong, Spiced, Smoked, Pickled, Preserved. Sandip Roy with Don't Let Him Know, which was a wonderful novel set partly in Kolkata, partly in San Francisco, and partly also in a small town in California. I was quite fond of that section as well. And Deepanjana Pal, who, in addition to being a wonderful critic who shares her book recommendations in the newsletter Dear Reader, has also found a second career as a thriller writer. Hushabye Baby, I loved the fact that the plot was satisfyingly detailed and PC and all of that. But I loved it also that Mumbai became a character in your book. And I'd like to start the session with Indranee. Just going through Spiced, Smoked, Pickled and Preserved. And I must confess that today we cooked a dal from your collection of recipes, the pasty dal with the roasted tomatoes. It worked out fantastically.
Thank you.
And you share 3 generations of Bengali family life in Shillong. And it also turns into a little snapshot of a historical time that no longer exists. It's not like you intended to be a historian, but you've captured that beautifully in the book. And you say, I wrote this down because I liked it so much. You say that dietary habits are generally not determined by political division, as we often believe that they are, but by topography, vegetation, and climate, And you say that a lot of our stories, a lot of our shared stories are food stories. So tell me what Shillong meant to you as a young child and then later as you lived there in terms of your food memories.
Yes. This food, the relationship between us and food is something very essential. It's something that is embedded in us. And I found that, especially because my father came from the other side of the border and my mother from this, I found that the food was similar. It was similar to Kasi. It was similar to those on this side and those on that side. So that's what made me think that, political borders are actually artificial. They should not naturally exist. And by making these borders, these man-made borders, what we also do is to make a separation with food habits, and that becomes very important. Politically, it becomes a kind of weapon. So my purpose for writing this book was to make it, a plea for inclusion, if you know what I mean. And if you go just by food, I found that really there was no very real difference between this side of the border and that side of the border. But of course, there was a difference between the hills and the plains. Particularly when I worked in Darjeeling, I found that the vegetation and, the products that we found were so similar. So it was like going back to my childhood. And if I go back to my childhood, you were asking how I spent it. I spent most of it outdoors, eating off the land, you might say. So that was something that was completely, it was put to a complete stop once we moved to Kolkata. There were many things we bought at the market, which we never did have to in Shillong. So that kind of thing, the closeness to nature, the proximity of it suddenly went. Yeah.
That's something I definitely want to come back to in the next round. I loved what you wrote. You said, our food comes with our stories. And in your memory, Shillong becomes this fairly sophisticated, quite cosmopolitan hill town,
yes,
where everything is at a slight difference from what you're used to in Kolkata. Hill watercress has a sharper bite. The fruits, the sour fruits and all of that are a little different from the plums and the apricots that you're used to.
yeah.
And there's a kind of familiar difference. And I do want to come back to that because there's a lot that you get into. You get into the history of families, but the history of also communities that were pretty eclectic and that were touched on one side by British influences, by Nepali influences, by local communities mingling, more than staying distant.
Yes.
And just moving to a slightly different stream, Deepanjana, if I could pull you in at this point. I think I was struck the first time I read Hushabye Baby. Of course, I just read it trying to find out, whether the gynecologist was guilty or not. I'm not going to let out any more spoilers than that. But the second time I read it, even before we'd thought about this panel, I remember thinking that it was incredible how many different Mumbais, Bombays you'd captured. And there was a line out there about Walkeshwar. Walkeshwar, thanks. Sorry, I don't know Mumbai that well, so I thought I'd better check that with you. They say in Mumbai's middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods, noise and light fill the streets. Here, in this secret garden of a lane, the dark was darker and the quiet was quieter. It was like a mirage within the silent city. And I was struck by the many contrasts because on one hand, there's this very wealthy and very discreet, everything off on the sidelines, Mumbai. And then there's the police stations and you get into the cops' lives so well and those narrow, small interrogation rooms, and there's the Bohri Muslim community that comes into it sideways. So not just a question about research, but I think often we assume that when we write about a city that you've been in for a long time, you write out of love or nostalgia. But sometimes you're writing actually as a reporter, right? Just seeing things clearly and seeing the many contrasts. And were you mindful of that?
I wrote Hushabye Baby in Delhi. I was in Delhi for about a year and a half. And that was the time when I actually finished writing Hushabye Baby. So in a sense, there was a lot of missing of Bombay that I was feeling. So not nostalgia in the conventional sense of the word of, looking backwards, but definitely a sense of missing home, because I've lived in Bombay for quite some time. But more importantly, I've been a working professional in Bombay, which I haven't actually been in any of the other cities that I've lived in. And I've lived in a fair number of cities. But Bombay is where I started off as a reporter, where I've done the most of my journalism. And I think that really came through while I was writing it, because in the process of being a journalist, if you are a beat journalist particularly, whether it's whether you're doing something like crime or civic reporting or even features, which is where I started. You just see so much of the city. Like you will, as a sort of, starting out as an art reporter, I would end up going to the Taj for a book launch, or because there was some party being thrown at a gallery nearby. And then the next day you would go to the artist's studio, which would be in a tiny little place in a lower middle class or even a poor part of the neighborhood. There'd be one daily story that you have to do that takes you to a completely different end of the city, completely different habits, circumstances. So I really got to see a lot of the city, and that's what I was trying to bring into the book. I mean, the book is very much about a Bombay that I had seen, but also I think in the process of writing, whether we're doing fiction or nonfiction, there's a certain amount of longing that fills writing about cities. We craft the city that we want to be in, and even when you're writing something like crime, I feel where obviously there are things that are going very wrong, but crime is in many ways, or rather it can be as a genre, incredibly hopeful, because traditionally crime carries with it the hope of things being set right. The genre, I mean, not the act of a crime, obviously, but the genre carries in it the hope of things restored, order being restored, of systems functioning despite everything going wrong. And I think that hope is very, very much at the heart of Bombay as a city as well. A lot of things fall apart, but ultimately everything works.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And again, I want to come back, but I'm mindful of time. Sandip, I remember when I read Don't Let Him Know, I was very struck by how deftly you sketched little portraits of the three places that feature in it. There's a small town really called Carbondale, there's San Francisco, and there's Calcutta. And you used to be, of course, a very well-known radio voice in San Francisco. And then when you came back to Calcutta, spent some of the year there, you started to do podcasts that are really lovely little snapshots of various aspects of Calcutta life. But you have a BDI on nostalgia, right? I don't think you trust it at all. You speak of a particular house in Calcutta and you say time seemed to have stopped in their living room, which is, of course, filled with old cuckoo clocks and a collection of dolls and pink plastic flowers that are beginning to get a little dusty, And of these three, which was the hardest to write, which was the most rewarding to write? And what did they give you?
I think in a way, Carbondale was the most rewarding to write because small towns like that rarely get written about. There are so many books that are set in Calcutta or San Francisco. And in some ways, you have to be wary of nostalgia while writing about these cities. Small, one university, Carbondale was such a small town. It only had one McDonald's. That's how small it was. Towns like that rarely get written with enormous nostalgia. And in fact, when I just thought about it today, in the first draft of the book, the town of Carbondale, which is in the American Midwest, and which is where I went to university. It was my introduction to America. San Francisco, New York were my dream of America. Carbondale was my reality. Carbondale, I had given it a completely fictional name. I'd called it Deansville or some such thing. And my editor, Dia Korazra, then at Bloomsbury Books, she was the one who sort of said, well, if we are calling Kolkata, Kolkata, and San Francisco, San Francisco, why does Carbondale have to have a pseudonym? And so I was like, oh, that's true. And then I had to actually rejiggle the parts where I had tried to hide what Carbondale was and fictionalize it and make it real again. But it was actually it's a town I have not been back to since I graduated from school. When I went to grad school there, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of Carbondale. I mean, growing up in Calcutta, when I went to Carbondale, I was sort of asphyxiated by the amount of greenery that was there. It was like I could almost not breathe because there was just too much oxygen all around me. And it was so small. It was when school would shut down, it felt really claustrophobic. The Indian students community was in each other's lives and each other's bedrooms and kitchens all the time. It was, I wanted anonymity going to America, and I felt like I had landed in like not even in my neighborhood, but like in your own house where everybody's in your business all the time. But it was interesting to me to revisit that place from a distance. I felt like of those three places, Carbondale was the one I had the most distance from by the time I started to write about it. And I could revisit it not just with nostalgia, but also with some of the the uneasiness I felt while I was there when I was trying to adjust to American life, and Carbondale was such a strange place. That had fallen away from it. And so in a way, I was more relaxed about it. And it actually made me very happy to write about Carbondale. Though now in retrospect, I think I should have pitched to my Southern Illinois University there and done a reading there or something, because I don't know how often Carbondale has been written about in
according to one of your readers on Goodreads, this is the only time she's ever come across Carbondale in a book.
There you go.
Really
Buckminster Fuller was from Carbondale. We used to have those little geodesic domes.
I can see a little local native pride coming back.
Yes, Go Salukis or something like that. I think that was the.
I just want to, for the sake of people who've just come in, I just want to hold up the books, and could I ask you, Sandip, to hold up Indranee's book? So. Yeah. So, if you see any of these three books, please buy them. And also Deepanjana's Hashabai Baby, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of because my mother stole it and won't give it back. She likes it. She's going to do the same with Indranee's book. So the next question, just again, I wish this conversation was longer, but I'm mindful of your time. It was a question for all of you, really. So just take it in turn and answer it. But how did writing about these places change your sense of them, or did it deepen a sense of belonging or curiosity or something of the sort? And I'm asking this particularly about Shillong because, again, there's so much in the way of Calcutta domination, which, again, coming from Calcutta, I'm very aware of. We tend to drown out a lot of other places in the East in literature, and that's only just changing,
Yes. Yes, that's true. Because the time that I'm writing about and the people I'm writing about, that's all vanished, it's no longer there. So, and while I was growing up in Shillong, you took things for granted. You took the beauty and the nature and that you haven't had around you for granted, You didn't really think very much about it until you came away from there. So, after a while, you begin to think, if you ever think of how that place had changed, it has most of the trappings of the city, and what it entails is a lot of construction. You see that happening. The forests are gone, roads are much wider, filled with dusty trees where there used to be lush forests all the way up. So much traffic, And I thought, these are stories I had told my children, time and time again. And then I thought, well, this was a lost time. And if I didn't write them down, maybe for my children, maybe possible grandchildren, then at least those stories would remain in the family. And inevitably, there was nostalgia, no doubt, but there was also a sense, it was kind of therapeutic to write about it, You sort of, you relived those times and you sort of could compare. And why those recipes came into the book, I think I should say, because every time I thought about those times, or I would talk about them with my sister or my aunts or someone, they'd say, "Oh, you remember that guy? Oh, remember what he cooked for the picnic? That was terrible." Or, always relating to food. So, so I thought, well, the stories and the food could be brought together because it was all there. Both of them were important. I just had to set them together. Yeah. So, and that is particularly, it's something you can do better if you're away from it.
I'm glad that you included the recipes, but I'm also glad that the way that you did it, because the book opens out first with, family stories, and then moves into a slightly larger overview. The moment that you're talking about food, you're writing about an entire way of life. You're writing about foraging. You're writing about the daily market. You're writing about, the English cakes.
Yes.
And, coexisting.
Yes, the multiculturality of it was what I tried to bring out, because by the time we left, there was a steady growth of ethnic separatism.
You hint at that. You say that there were certain things that happened before the language divide. You speak of a society where multiple languages flow without tension. Then there is a barrier. Yeah. And you're very clear about locating this as a time when it was normal for Bengalis and other communities to move there. Yes. So I did have this feeling of something being preserved with great clarity. And I understand a little better now how that might have changed you. And just to pull Deepanjana into this, the reverse problem. When you're writing about a city like Bombay or Calcutta also comes into Hush by a Baby. You're writing about places that have been so written about already. And you might not deliberately start off trying to, find something new. But again, in the process of writing about these places for a thriller, did your view of them change?
So I think part of the problem, if you're someone like me who's also read a fair number of thrillers and books in general about Bombay, you become particularly conscious of everything that you don't want to put in a book. Like, I knew that I did not want to have a stroll down Colaba Causeway, that I would shoot myself in the head if my character went to Kamathipura, things like that. But I was listening to Indranee talk about the food, and I literally just started reading the book, and that sort of interweaving of the food and the stories, it just reminded me of something very different when I was writing Hasha by Baby. One of the things when I was researching it, one of the things, being a particularly greedy, my central question to this cop that I was talking to was, what do you guys have for snacks? Because the police canteen does not offer you much by way of range. There's misal pav, which has a certain cult fondness is what I'm going to go with. But I was like, this cannot sustain you. Like, surely no. And that was when he was saying vada pav. Like, what is this city without vada pav? And it's true. Like, when you think of Bombay, there are these street foods which are they are the story of the city. And they unite the city in ways that perhaps even cricket and Bollywood don't. But in terms of, sort of seeing the city in a new light, I mean, I don't think it necessarily made me see the city in a different way, but it did make me very conscious of, why certain tropes have become tropes about the city, of any city that gets written about. There's certain places when you're looking at it from a reader's point of view, like, oh my God, yet another scene set in this part of the neighborhood. Really? Could you not go anywhere else? And then when you're writing, you just suddenly realize that you've read all of these places so many times that your imagination just takes your characters there. And then you have to actively figure out ways of not doing that. And I think when you have a certain, that's where I think what Sandip was talking about, the distance from a place, I think that makes a lot of difference from the perspective of writing, because when you have achieved that distance, then you sort of understand geographically why certain areas work for the story that you want to tell.
One of my secret pleasures is actually walking around cities with the books that I love. And I have to confess, Deepanjana, I've done a little bit of that in Bombay with Hashbai Baby, without you by my side. Sandeep, a slightly different question for you. I love the fact that you're such a visual writer when you turn your attention to novels. But everything that you've done in radio, you're also so carefully attuned to sound. And when you think of Calcutta, what comes to mind first? Is it the sounds? Is it the textures? Is it what you see from the window? The smells, the food, which?
Well, I lived right next to Lake Market. So for all of my growing up, the sound was the market being set up at about 5 a.m, and that noise. And then the smell of the garbage truck carrying the garbage away in the middle of the day. So that comes inside. Yeah. But there are certain sounds that you don't necessarily hear as regularly anymore, but which would be the soundscape of a city. And there was, like the sound of trams trundling down the main road not far from us. And for a while, when I came back to Kolkata, I used to actually just capture sounds of things. I would go running out to the road whenever, like the guy who fluffs quilts come by, and they have that little thing that goes trung, trung, trung. I would capture all those sounds, the sound of the bikriwala, the sound of the person selling good or fruits, vendors and things like that. I just loved capturing those sounds and seeing how much those sounds have changed, because, in my childhood, there was no sound of someone selling momos, but now it's a much more ubiquitous sound all over the city. So I am really attuned to the sound. But one thing I wanted to also say in base of what Deepanjana was saying, it's true. I mean, I don't think when I started writing Don't Let Him Know, I was conscious of the fact that I might be writing about these cities. I was too focused on trying to bring these characters to life. The city sneaks because it's in the marrow of the characters. So in the end, the city is also there. It's only later I realized I haven't written about Calcutta as much as I have written about South Calcutta, which is very different from North Calcutta. Not that people in Bombay or London care to know the difference, but and I would be horrified if somebody did the cover of my book and insisted on putting the Howrah Bridge or the Victoria Memorial in there, and because neither of those feature in the book, whereas any Bollywood film in Kolkata, they seem to always get a room which has a little terrace with a view of the Howrah Bridge from no matter what part of Kolkata they're staying in. Also, there's nobody in a white shari with the red border in the book, but there are plenty of other tropes that are, when I look back now, there's a great grandmother, there's, God help us, there are mangoes and mango chutney. I mean, what could be more? I noticed the mango chutney. But in that sense, it's both the visual and the auditory that is part of my soundscape of the city. And going back to what I was saying before, when I first went to Carbondale, the first weeks, I would not be able to sleep at night because of how quiet it was. I would and in America, people we would keep the windows shut. I would go and open the windows and in the middle of the night and hang out, straining to hear the sound of a city. It made me realize how noisy Calcutta is, even in the dead of night. And in Carbondale, there's a constant hum. It's like a refrigerator going around, right? Yeah. Like even in your house, there's this hum of people sleeping. There's a hum. Yes, the city hums in a way that Carbondale didn't. And I would wake up
people in Calcutta
and be scared that we'd been buried alive or something.
You were saying also.
Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt, but it's also people in Kolkata have extraordinary conversations in the middle of the road, yelling at each other, not because they're fighting. It's a conversation. And they know, I think.
That's because of the ambient noise, I think.
Yeah,
they have to speak louder. People in the city speak louder.
Also, I think they do want to share it with the neighborhood.
Exactly. Everyone is convinced of their own brilliance. And therefore, they must speak louder so that the entire neighborhood can hear just what amazing insights they have. It's incredible.
Yes. You also capture some of the sounds of Shillong, the football crowds, the conversations in Nepali. And
what happened there was because of the quiet around. It wasn't quiet. It was quite loud with birds and crickets and jackals and all that. But what I mean is that there was no city hum. So you could hear sounds that came from 2 or 3 hills away, and some of them might have been echoes. But you could hear all of them, and these little boys would have this song that they sang when they won a football match, and it would go, Neela Jop, Yaka ball, meaning we've won at football, yeah? And then they would go around the neighborhood asking for treats and money so that they could go and buy another football or do something of the sort. And then there were the Nepali communities, every evening they would have this drumming and Deusure, that was the chorus.
This is such a lovely note to...
So everything came. And of course, the Khasis are wonderful musicians and singers,
Yeah.
So,
but also a wonderful note to close on.
Would have a guitar and, they would be strumming their guitars and singing A Hard Day's Night or, I'm a loser. Yes, very often it was I'm a loser.
I feel like I have this beautiful sense now of Calcutta and the bustle of Mumbai and of Shillong. I think we're almost close to the last few questions. We've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience. So one is for Sandip, but I think it applies to a lot to both of you as well. You worked and lived in various cities. So please tell us a professional incident in a different city that helped you enrich your writing. I'm not fully sure about that, but
I'm not sure what you mean by a professional incident, but I will say I think leaving Calcutta helped me write about Calcutta. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think in my book, the Carbondale years are drawn very much from my own experiences of Carbondale. And I think it was going to Carbondale where I actually did first encounter what something like race meant in a way which had always seemed much more abstract to me in Kolkata, where, we would recite Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream in elocution class with quivering voices, but no idea about actually what the pain that was embedded in that speech. But there you suddenly understood what racial divide was. You understood some of these things. And it actually, in a weird way, also helps you then come back and see things like caste and think all the things that you just never noticed because of your own privilege and being surrounded by people like you. So in that sense, going outside did help enrich my writing because it opened up my world to something beyond Bengalis talking about indigestion and
absolutely, and I think this is common to, again, the three of you. For you, Shillong became a subject, a place that you wanted to write about many years after you'd had to move out.
Yes, almost 50, more than 50. Yeah, more than 50. Yeah. No, 50, yes.
Okay.
So, yes, what happens is that the distance makes, in time and space, the distance gives you a clearer view. You remember more details. And in my case, because I'm so much older than the rest of you, memories of childhood come back much sharper than memories of the recent past, So, as I said, yes. So you sort of remember the sounds, you remember the smells, and then you compare them with what you found when you came to Kolkata. 4:30 in the morning, the early tram trundling past, And all night I was kept awake by this bolo hori bol, corpses being taken to Nimtola Ghat, and the smell of the charcoal fires in the morning. And,
yes.
Yes.
That's very
and yes, and all that street food, the hing kochuri and everything frying. So it was very, very different. And it was, yes, quite welcome for a time. Yes. I don't know if I would, carry on feeling the same way, because everything that becomes familiar also loses its magic, right?
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yes. So I think even with Shillong, maybe because I'm away from it, there was a little magic I wanted to capture.
And you did. And last, Deepanjana, this is a question from one of the audience members. Says, do you read how other writers write about a specific city before writing your own? And I thought that was a perfect question for you because you are such, a dedicated reader as such. And did you just put that out of your mind when you sat down to write your own books?
In an ideal world, you'd be able to do that, right? Like you'd just be able to approach the city without anybody else's writing having influenced you. But I don't think that's possible. I'm not sure that's even necessarily a good thing. I'm a great believer in the theory that a good writer begins with a prolific reader. So if you haven't read a lot, I don't think you can really aspire to write well. You can write. I mean, anybody can write. But if you want to write well, I think reading a lot is a good starting point. So I think it becomes inevitable if you are going to write about cities like Calcutta, Kolkata, Mumbai, Bombay, London, New York, Paris, which have just inspired so many artists and creators over the last few decades, or centuries actually. But I think it would be great to be able to approach a city as though you've never written, as though nobody's ever written about it before. And it's something that I think we have seen some of in Indian literature with, more writers writing about smaller towns, about other cities, because shockingly, there are other cities in this country. So I think in an ideal world, you want to be able to approach it in a way that you've picked up the good things of how another writer has written about a city, but you still see the city in your own distinctive individual perspective.
That's perfect, actually. And that is the perfect note to close on. Just a request to the three of you. There are several questions from the audience that we weren't able to take. And if the AKLF team could put them up on the Facebook page, then perhaps we could go back at some point of time and have a shot at answering them. But a wonderful food memoir about Shillong, thoughtful and really evocative of a lost time and a lost set of experiences. One of my favorite thrillers, set in Mumbai, very feisty, very well plotted, and saturated with parts of the city that are not so often written about by Deepanjana. And of course, Shuddeep's book, which swings between Calcutta and Kolkata, Carbondale, San Francisco, and uses each one of them to bring out his characters and bring out their conflicts in a way that I found quite beautiful and very moving. Thank you so much, all three of you, for your time and for your patience with us.
Thank you, Nilanjana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Apeejay and Oxford Bookstore for organizing this.
Absolutely. And I hope that we will, all right, we are out of time. I just want to say thank you to Apeejay and to the team and to every one of you in the audience for your questions. We'll do our best to answer those. One from Vivek Juja for the three of you. Which city outside the country lures you the most to write about it?
Oh, I am yet to discover it. Actually, I think when I went to Hanoi, it made me want to write about it, but then I realized for all the wrong reasons, because in a weird way, it was reminding me of Kolkata. And I'm like, no, I don't want to write about Kolkata via Hanoi.
I haven't even thought about it.
But do you think you would ever write about Kolkata?
Me? About Kolkata? Well, that's an idea. I don't
Wonderful.
know. Let's
And
see.
Deepanjana?
This is
Any
just
chance
making me
you
think of
ever
all
had
the
Delhi?
places that I want to travel to. Sorry, what did you say?
You just mentioned a place you want to travel to. Maybe somebody listening will say.
Seoul,
Yeah.
right now, if someone would give me a ticket to either Seoul or any city in Japan, I will very happily consider writing about it. But what were
I was
you
actually
saying?
I was going to ask whether you would ever write about Delhi.
Oh,
Oh my
I would
God,
love
that's
to.
deep.
I would love to. But I don't think there is a nicer introduction to Delhi in recent times than Wildings. So I mean, just
Oh, thank you.
seeing
That's
the
very
city
kind of
from
you.
a completely different perspective, as in a 3-foot high perspective, it's just, I mean, I don't even know where I'd approach the city. I just see it through all of your eyes.
Thank you. That's so kind. But anyway, three marvelous writers. And I wish the session had been a little longer, but thank you for everything that you shared.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Deepanjana and Sandip. And
Thank you.